Sorry.
Okay, Anna, we're going to go to you.
Perfect. Hi, everybody. You've welcome in as we're just getting settled in here, and you're getting settled in too. Welcome in this afternoon on behalf of Fourth Space. We'd like to thank you for making the time to join us this afternoon. Special thanks, obviously, to our panelists, Deanna Bowen and Rachelle Dickenson, and Conversations in the Contemporary Art convener Maya Ray Oppenheimer for activating this virtual space for us today. For those of you unfamiliar with us, Concordia's Fourth Space, physically located on unceded Indigenous land in downtown Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is a university-wide platform focused on working collaboratively, with our community across disciplines to activate research, teaching, and initiatives via process-based explorations, which is why we're delighted to take part in these conversations. This is a very short intro as we're eager to get the conversation rolling here today, but I'll just note that we are recording this talk and it will be available on our YouTube channel. I can put the link in the chat. We're currently live streaming at CU Fourth Space on Facebook, and feel free to share that stream on your own page if you wish. Again, I can put it in the chat. And the Q&A is open for your questions if you are a texter, if you like to text, or we invite you to raise your virtual hand if you'd like to be unmuted to speak during the question period. And as always, the chat is activated for all so that you can kind of pipe in with your comments or thoughts throughout. Please choose the panelist and attendee tab from the drop-down menu so that everybody can see your reflections. Okay, on that note, it's my pleasure to pass proceedings over to Maya. Over to you.
Thank you so much for the handover, Anna. Thank you as always. Welcome everybody to this afternoon's conversation. As Anna introduced me, I'm the convener of Conversations in Contemporary Art, which is run out of the Department of Studio Arts MFA program. And it's an annual program that welcomes various guests to share their perspectives and expertise and thoughts and positions from writers, curators, artists, educators, and so on. For the past year, since September, we've been exploring themes related to radical hospitality in this event. And rather than defining it, we've been exploring its textures, asking questions like, how can a speaker series that is attached to an institution be radical? Is it a matter of the institution claiming radicality, the people within it committing to radical acts? What does it mean to be hospitable during COVID? Other questions like how can we expand a platform that has traditionally been a series of events and talks to our communities and constituencies. We've been running initiatives like micro grants to artists, starting our first practitioner and remote residence, which is the Graph Gallery Collective, and just sort of running this program almost like a research creation. And today, I'm warming up this Zoom space with a mixture of emotions. I'm feeling deep gratitude to Rachelle Dickenson and Deanna Bowen, our guests this afternoon, for your time and energy during COVID on this emerging spring day. Grateful to all of you audience folks for spending your time with us, but also with a bit of weight. It's the 11th of March, so it's a calendrical year of the announcement of the global pandemic by the World Health Organization. Of course, noting that for months before that global announcement, COVID-19 has been affecting communities. But it was the 13th of March that Concordia made the decision to close its campuses. And that, of course, has directly affected all of us, but also how CICA convenes. So I would love for us to take a moment to think about our connections rather than our separations. And that is a connection not only to each other, facilitated through the Zoom space, but also to land in our communities around us. I'm convening this via Zoom, but also in Tiohtià:ke, Mooniyang, Montreal, which is the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. I'm in East Montreal, Tiohtià:ke. And if I look outside my window, I see that snow is melting. We're entering sugarbush season. Maple syrup is running in our tree friends. And Deanna is also joining us from Tiohtià:ke. Rachel is in Ottawa, which is the ancestral lands of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. And please let us know where you are zooming in from. You'll see there's a setting on the chat where you can communicate not only to us, but to each other in the panelists and attendees option in the chat. So welcome, and we encourage you through the rest of the day to pay attention to what's going on in the land and communities around you and take note. Now, focusing on our guests this afternoon, some brief intros. I would love to paraphrase, if it's okay with you and Rachelle and Deanna, your biographies. I should also say Rachelle is joining us with Melvis, a dog sitting friend who will be with us this afternoon. But Deanna, despite being colleagues, we have yet to meet well, I want to say in real life, but face to face, right? We've been in Zoom situations. I've been like a lurking audience member in some other talks you've been giving on the Zooms. We've been in group chats on text. But regardless of the framing where I've been sharing space with you, I've always felt like I want to be listening and taking in the energies and wisdom and perspectives that Deanna is bringing into a space. One of those spaces is also on the page. And I mention this because, you know, Deanna is one of these multi-hyphenate workers across writing, curation, teaching, theory, conversation, which we're approaching as a material practice. And, you know, it has impacts like locally through their work, but also has been recognized with federal national scale organizations, including the Governor General's Award, Guggenheim Fellowship Awards, and various accolades. And it's, you know, it's been a long time planning and looking forward to this conversation with you, Deanna, and how radical hospitality is manifested in your work, whether or not you use that language, but methods of care, of pushing back on structures of power, thinking about collaboration. And it's with that method that Deanna has brought Rachelle into this conversation space. I've only met Rachelle via email very recently and with a bit of pre-live chat in the Zoom. But Deanna and Rachelle are going to speak more about how they know each other. And Rachelle also is a multi-hyphenate cultural producer through writing, through scholarship, through curation. One of the projects that I think will come up in your conversation is your curatorial work in Àbadakone, Continuous Fire at the National Gallery, which was the last thing I got to see in the before times. I took the train to Ottawa and spent a lot of time in those gallery spaces and ran into some students there, which is such a nice encounter. So welcome both of you. I'm really happy to be sharing this space with you. I'm going to turn off my video now. That doesn't mean I'm going off to have a snack. You'll see me in the chats. I'm happy to help as we go along. And I'll return when we get to the discussion Q&A period at the end of your remarks. So it's with happiness I hand the mic over to both of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you very much for having us. I appreciate it. I guess we should probably, well, see, I'm already undoing the plan, right? Rachelle, you were going to introduce us. But
that's okay. No, you do undo the plan.
Okay, I'm going to undo the plan and explain to everybody that we're actually going to be talking about our grocery lists and spring cooking. No, I'm joking. It's a pre-talk joke. Sorry.
There's a thaw happening.
Yeah, there's a thaw happening. So, my friend, I'm going to pass this over to you so that you can do what I asked you to do, and I will happily follow your lead.
Okay, thanks. Yes, I am coming from Ottawa, which is unceded Algonquin territory and the home of the governance for the nation state and the National Gallery of Canada, where I worked in two stints, one from 2013 to 2016, and then from 2017 to 2019. It was an incredibly interesting program. I identify as a settler with Métis, Red River Métis ancestry, and I do so, and maybe this will come up later in our conversations, but I do so to speak to the contemporary political moment that we live in, to honor the development and articulation of Métis nationhood over the last several decades, but also the political climate that we have now for troubling identity monikers and processes of naming who gets to name what and how that works. And it's also a part of that is to gesture to the fact that I wasn't raised in a Métis community. I was raised settler, white settler predominantly, and with all the privilege and glory and, you know, ease that comes with that so many people don't register as existing. So Deanna and I connected, actually, I think really connected. We met many years ago in Montreal, but we connected during my work in Àbadakone. And I was working with Greg Hill and Christine Lalonde as a co-curator on that project. And it's a huge project, and it was such an honor to do that work. The thing that I found really interesting in talking with Deanna was to have the opportunity to talk frankly about what the NGC did when they installed artwork by Black folks who are also Indigenous. So what then, we had a great conversation in the space. What then does that mean when a federal settler colonial institution that is the NGC not only mounts an exhibition specifically about people who identify as Indigenous, with artwork by people who identify as Indigenous, but then also to layer on top of that people who identify as Indigenous and are Black and are from South Africa or from different parts of the world, because there was many countries represented in that exhibition. And it's a really interesting question, because the stakes are quite high. And I think the stakes are high, and Deanna, you can correct me, but I think the stakes are high because of how not just the NGC, but sort of colonial institutional ideology hasn't grappled with the dynamism of not only concepts of global indigeneity, but also assumptions about what indigeneity looks like. And how do you occupy a settler colonial space when those histories have been erased from those archives? And in my case, the research that I'm interested in is administrative operations. So it's a really jerky, kind of inelegant introduction into sort of how we got talking. That conversation was great, though. It was really powerful. Because I don't know what the answer is. You know, I haven't had a chance to talk to Greg and Christine extensively about that. We talked about how important it was to have Indigenous folks from those regions represented, and it was a priority that was carried over from Sakahan. But what does it mean in the long run? What does it mean for the NGC as the state representing institution and a knowledge producer? What are their responsibilities? What does it look like for audience members?
I can speak to that, because when I went to the exhibition, I mean, the show in and of itself was just extraordinary and mind-blowing, and it just filled my heart with joy to see this happen. It is a critically important moment in kind of the similar ways to Okwe and Wazor's first kind of critical exhibition that opened the door around racialized bodies in the global art world. It's comparable. It's very much in that neck of the woods. So in and of itself, what that exhibition brought to the table, the conventions that it broke, the power that it took up, the space that it took up, was truly inspirational and you know, emotionally overwhelming, right? In many ways. And then to wander through that exhibition, I get to see all my friends and I get to see their work, and that's all cool. And I'm very happy about all of that. I'm so proud of everybody that's in that show. And then to turn the corner and then find these Black bodies from the continent. And I'm just like, oh my God, that just, for me, that was just such a massive moment. This conscious troubling of the narrative around indigeneity, not to undo anything, but to expand it in such a important way, right? And I think why it matters is for, you know, in my mind, in my Black Indigenous lineage that I'm still trying to parse together, in my mind, I mean, that's where real conversations around solidarity happen, is if we open up this conversation around indigeneity, right? and Black and Indigenous bodies, all kinds of Indigenous bodies. I mean, really, there Asian Indigenous communities. I mean, there's all kinds of different communities, right? But opening up indigeneity, that notion of indigeneity, was such an important crack in the institutional foundation, I think. And so, what does it mean? Well. In the same vein as the Canadian and the Indigenous and Canadian rehang, I would say that the institution has an obligation, any institution really for that matter, but the National Gallery in particular has a responsibility to fill in the gaps. Now that it's opened it up, right? Now that you've done this rehang that repositions Indigenous culture and peoples within that white settler narrative, now that you've started that conversation, it's not a perfect shift in any way. It's not a perfect rehang, but it is the beginning of something. It is the beginning of acknowledgement of abuses of power and theft of land and cultural genocide, all of those things. It's super important. I don't think it's done the job of fully embracing just the totality of all that, but it matters. And I think now that Àbadakone has established this other kind of benchmark, that's not the right word, but this other marker, this other acknowledgement of what indigeneity looks like, I would think they've committed to starting the work. I think they should continue to do the work, right? And in doing so, that should open the door to all the other Indigenous bodies that we're talking about that either have been, how should we say, propelled here through, global plunder, empires, global plunder in other places, right? And how they find their ways to this nation and all of that stuff, right? But I would say that the National Gallery is obliged to update the file, the deeply, deeply, deeply outdated file, right? And create some other substructures in there because there's a whole bunch of stuff that's just not there. And they're lovely people. I enjoy working with them, and as I think you have, but it's a complicated relationship because there's so much work to do. There's so much work to do. And these large institutions move quite slowly. Yeah. Not fast enough in my mind to correct the historical omissions of it all, right? So that's what I'm thinking about with that. I wanna, if you don't mind, I'm gonna just quickly show a slide because I wanted to talk about this on that same tip of Blackness and indigeneity, and I'll bring it back to my practice just so I can kind of open the door to something else. So fingers crossed. Here we go. Where I want to go is all the way there at the end, so you'll get a very quick run through. I'll come back to the rest of it, but. What I want to get to is the end. I want to get to the end. That's what I want to get to. I want to get to this room. Sorry, I'll get my chat thing out of the way there and all my various other things. I want to come back to this room. And so this is a couple of quote unquote chapters, constellations of images that I pieced together for the Black Drones in the Hive show that's at the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery. Massive beast of a show for me. And I'm going back into the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery's archive to bring forward, the seminal Canadian works that populate the National Gallery, the Homer Watsons and the Group of Seven and all those white men that painted those Canadian landscapes that were absent of anybody else, certainly absent of any Black or Indigenous bodies. So looking at the KWAG's collection, no different than the National Gallery's collection, really, or any other regional institution in the country, I'd say. And what we did for this exhibition, amongst other things, is we pulled those works out and did a salon hang in a space with one contemporary work that I pieced together, and it's this image on this work on the left, which is It's called The Refugee, or A North Side View of Slavery, Sofia Pulley and John Francis, who are two former slaves who gave an oral history of their experiences in Southern Ontario in the late 18s. And it's paired with an oral piece that has that is playing back an Eagle song by my good friend Archer Chalice. And it's a parabolic speaker, so you really only can hear his song if you are directly in, if you are honoring, if you are witnessing Sofia Pulley and John Francis's testimony, their oral history. And what I think is interesting about those two in particular is, one, the way that it introduces Black bodies onto the landscape, but it also is bringing forward this other kind of complicated Black indigeneity. And here, what this image is, I think my next one is right. Let me show you. Let's see if I can go a little bit further. So this is another shot of the room. So these are all those kinds of old white men paintings that get on my nerves. But what matters here is this piece. So the story, Sofia Pulley's oral history, effectively is one. I should clarify that I discovered it within Black archives, quote unquote, Black American, African American archives. This was certainly not an archive that was found within a quote unquote Native American archives, right? So I want to kind of flag that for what this piece kind of illustrates. And so what the oral history is Sofia Pulley is actually one of Mohawk Chief Joseph Brant's slaves. And her oral history basically recounts her experiences of being sold in the United States and then transported to a region where Joseph Brant was in the United States. I'm going to assume it's in the New York region, in and around there. And she was sold to him, and he brought her and some other Black slaves to what we now call Brantford, and they built his home, and she served him and his family, and they grew up with them and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, what's interesting about her is, one, the kind of space that she takes up within the Canadian narrative, right smack dab in the crack of things, you know? And then thinking about how she was effectively lost, her Indigenous culture, her Indigenous background or upbringing was completely obliterated to the fact that her Blackness overshadowed it because she was buried in a Black only archive, yeah? So I think that's a really interesting thing to bring forward. I don't even know where it fits on the Canadian cultural map, so to speak, as far as art history goes. I have no idea.
It doesn't yet. I think
doesn't yet.
There's a lot of incredible niche scholarship on both sides of the border, particularly when it comes to Haudenosaunee historical military leadership and the socio-political climate, which is incredibly dense, right?
Yep.
And you know, it's not just about Joseph Brant, but the other aspect of this is, and it goes back to this question, the reason that the question about what the NGC did, what they do every time they mount an exhibition, but specifically what did they do by mounting an Indigenous specific survey exhibition that includes Indigenous folks from Taiwan, Central and South Africa, from Guatemala, from Norway, all of these Indigenous folks all look different. So when you're thinking about where you found this book, and the fact that it was not part of an Indigenous archive or what would statistically or normally be approached for Indigenous content, I think it indicates quite clearly the way that settler colonialism has effectively separated Indigenous and Blackness from each other through the historical development of the nation state. And I think it's an administrative function.
Absolutely.
Which is an interesting aspect. It's also, it belies a level of insidiousness.
For sure.
Yeah.
Gosh, a couple of years ago, Lonnie Bunch came to Toronto. Lonnie Bunch, for those of you who don't know, is the director founder of the African American Smithsonian. I call it the Blacksonian, so do other folks, but you know, just saying. We had dinner and with a bunch of other folks, and I was talking to him about Black indigeneity because of my family's connection to quote unquote Indian territory prior to it becoming Oklahoma. And, you know, there's so much American scholarship around Black indigeneity in Indian territory, in Oklahoma, that whole thing, right? And it stops. But it is a shared kind of historical, you know, narrative, right? So I asked him, well, why is it that the Black Smithsonian and the Native American Smithsonian don't work together to kind of build across those bridges? And that's not to say, and he responded by saying they do workshops about genealogy, that kind of stuff, but there's nothing, you know, historically or significantly historical that they're doing together. And it explained to me that it was always grounded in money, right? As things often are. But what that ultimately leads to is a direction to the federal government and their desire, their need to keep things separate. And, you know, it begs the question, okay, so if you go back in time, what were the reasons behind the need to keep them separate in and of itself? And then going back again to my own family history and going back to Indian territory, going back to all that stuff, and looking at the way through our current research, looking at the way that mixed blood Black Indigenous bodies were framed as this, you know, mongrel breed of people that made it just kind of the worst of the worst, obviously. It's like that classification that there is such a thing as a caste society within all of this, right? But that all of us are just kind of lumped in together. And then the desire to divide obviously does that work of breaking down the solidarities, because there is a real solidarity come the 1900s between Black and Indigenous peoples in that region, right? So yeah, what is it? But it's also, I would, you know, taking it back to the NGC and administration, you know, always this administration always goes back to, again, white, always, I'm going to say this out loud. I know I'm going to go to, you know, I'm going to go to hell. I'm going to say it anyhow, because, you know, but that administration is always, again, connected to something around resources or money and white people trying to take something from somebody. I said that out loud.
You did.
I did. You know that meme on Facebook about you say some statement and there's a card at the bottom that says, prove me wrong? I kind of feel like that. Right? Kind of wrong. I mean, you know, it's just true story.
I think a large part of it in my experience has to do with habits. Tribal research habits. It has to do with methodologies for producing, organizing, and disseminating knowledge. Understanding these,
or erasing, or burying, or
exactly.
Right.
And looking at the genealogy of art galleries who have had I think their role in the development of the nation state has been largely underestimated, which is ironic. But I think, where was I going with this? It's a genealogy of policy and practice that's reinforced and reinforces systemic racisms within institutional practice, so that it presupposes that there is actually one really good way to do everything, and that one way just happens to be based on white Eurocentric experience of this place over time. Interestingly, the institutional manifestation of that, I think, is what makes them so hard to have, so slow to change, is that people moving into the spaces don't see how the operational actions, the infrastructures, the, you know, turning lights on, turning lights off, like the really basic function of the building tied to the usually problematically vague mandate of the organization at provincial and federal levels, certainly, and occasionally at a regional level with regional galleries. Those are all connected. and they're connected through how we work. What constitutes labor? How do we value particular kinds of labor? And how do those assumptions about the value of labor cancel out, for example, really common debate right now, cancel out Indigenous story as a legitimate form of legal claims to sovereignty, but also as a legitimate form of knowledge transmission that operates outside of that hierarchy. So this is really interesting. I'm thinking through how the visible space is one thing. There's the administrative actions that occur in that space that impact and reify supremacies, particular kinds of supremacies at certain times of the year, for the staff, whether or not they come in with those ideologies, right? Because the job carries that with it. And I'm working on becoming more specific about it, but then it brings me to your installation, to your art practice, which isn't troubled by being curatorial or artwork. It doesn't seem to be concerned with negotiating those two job titles, which is interesting. But also you're drawing from an incredible amount of data from romanticized representations of nationhood vis-a-vis paintings and romanticized versions of land, but also from labor specific pamphlets and archives and, and trying to connect these across, not just in the arts, like this is not about this practice. So when I'm working with you, the genealogy of institutions gets blown open in really interesting ways that appeal to the administrative geek in me.
Same.
Yeah, because the
Same.
administration, like so many people move through these spaces without thinking about the impact that administrative functions have on how you perform and how you behave and what you ask for as an artist or a curator in a given space. And I do think it all ties back to pre-Confederation Canada, Upper and Lower Canada, like just the way that this state has been built up and on whose backs.
Yeah. And also, I think it's important, especially in the Canadian context, to talk about class as we speak to race and Blackness and indigeneity, race, ethnicity, the face of the nation, all of those things, right? Another person I think that's doing this kind of work is Crystal Mowry, also is thinking through these same questions. Lisa Meyer is also thinking through these questions about the everyday things that you do. And I think with my working with racialized and Indigenous curators, I mean, we're having really fantastic conversations about how to literally, I want to say blow up. That's not quite what it is. I really am deeply preoccupied with like blowing up the G7, that whole era of art history, and just like providing through my artwork enough evidence to deeply question the narrative, deeply question the history, and to bring to the fore all the people that contributed to the lie. Now, which happens to be virtually every institution that continues to put on a group of 7 exhibition and deify them and all that kind of stuff. You're all, for all y'all's watching, you're adding to the problem. I'm going to hell. Steve Martin is going to track.
Yeah, you're out.
Oh God. So y'all know Steve Martin's a big Lauren Harris fan, and blah, 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 blah. So, but it does make the question, for how did this narrative of Canadian art history get constructed? And it didn't just fall from the sky. It was something that was created by people. Originally, the ruling class of people, a deeply kind of, I'm going to say incestuous, kind of industrial, commercial, socially connected individuals, plus the royals. They built a system. Their children inherited the system, or their children's generation inherited the system. They perpetuated by teaching it to the next generation of children, et cetera, right? But that does, what I'm trying to get to is that does include the recent curators that continue to reify this. The active doing of it right now is still doing that work of deeply entrenching a white nationalist narrative, right?
Mhm.
So the beauty of working with you or other curators that are kind of on the tip is that we're not concerned with that. We have an understanding that that is a manufactured narrative. And because we all now have access through administration or education, or even as an artist who works to manipulate the system, what we're trying to do is, again, what I envision is just a complete, I want it to be rubble. I want that narrative to be I'm not really a violent person, people, but I do think that it's a deeply problematic narrative that causes great harm, great harm.
Yeah.
Still,
Yeah.
And
the power and pervasiveness of the investment in racial supremacy.
Yeah.
In that genealogy.
Yeah.
Right, because it's tied to a set of global communities that supported that idea as well, right? So it's not, Canada is young. I think a lot about, when we talk, I think a lot about the description that Deborah Dockstader gave about a Neshone scholar who's no longer with us. She talked about colonialism as an episode. Not to minimize it, but to indicate that it's 27 minutes of thousands and thousands of years of indigenous existence, political mobilization, right? So if you think about the establishment of cultural institutions in that 27 minutes, right, it's going to be a bit sloppy, and it's also going to be incredibly aggressive and pervasive ideologically. Tie that into the mobilization of Black bodies onto the continent in order to forward the racial supremacy and the economic development of that racial supremacy. So these institutions literally grow out of that marsh.
But then to add to it, it's not only just the bringing the bodies here to the Black bodies here to do the extractive work. It's not just that. Those Black bodies are taken from someplace else. Also with the intention of minimizing or literally reducing the population. Let me rephrase that. Committing genocide in order to extract from these other places, and these bodies that are brought to Canada are, this is really about displacement, and it's still akin to slavery in its function, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and there's another scholar that I was thinking about is part of the mechanisms, I think, that make it so difficult to extract these histories or make these histories evident within institutional practice, is this investment in, and it's the public's investment in perceiving institutions as monoliths, right? As these things that are not populated by people who, the institutions only function because they're run by human beings, ergo human beings can change them.
Absolutely.
Which shifts the focus of, I think, critical curatorial practice fundamentally, because then you no longer can say, oh, well, the policy is this, and we should follow the policy. It's like, well, yeah, okay, so we can't go in and change the administrative infrastructure, say the NGC, for every exhibition. But what, and there, some people would say, why not? That's a good question. We could, yeah.
Why not?
Yeah, but well, yeah, people have tried.
Yeah.
So trying to backtrack and understand again what's invested in racial supremacy in that genealogy. What's at stake for white settler Canadians who believe in these organizations, and I happen to be one person who believes in these organizations, and I can't understand what might be lost. So if you're going to blow up G7, it seems like Canada will be lost, which we know isn't true, right? Because it's that tension in public institutions, is the tension between how institutions process data about the public and what that knowledge does to institutional operations.
Sure.
And it's obviously an imagined public to a certain extent.
Sure, sure. And to be clear, I'm gonna get in trouble. I think that for the longest time, the National Gallery's assumed audience was white settlers, period, right? And so there's like a, it's a roundabout kind of a thing. So if we talk about what administration does in a context like that, white audience, white administration, it just kind of feeds a cycle of enhanced or increasing whiteness, right? So that's its own thing. I had a thought, it's gone. It was brilliant though.
I bet. I don't doubt that at all. Well, the one thing that I was going to ask you then, in your practice, I feel and I see how your practice intervenes into these spaces in multiple ways, and impacts individuals in those places. Mm-hmm. Is it part of your intention to mobilize these archives in order to disturb not just the gallery space or the audience that's seeing it, but you have to work with archivists at Library and Archives, you have to work at archivists at Hart House, you have to work with archivists at U of T, at Carleton, at NGC, at all these different places, right? So, and also in the States and in England, it's an international practice by necessity, because Canada and the US is an international part of an international or global economy. Yeah. What do you think of that? I don't know where I was going with that, but
yeah, that was the setup to something.
You're going to do really well. It's going to be brilliant, Deanna. It's going to be brilliant.
Okay. Oh,
you got this.
Wow. Oh, wow.
Okay, so your work does this, right?
Yes.
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 The strategy? Are you
edges
to crack all of these archives?
Yeah, but don't get me wrong. I mean, for all of my brouhaha about Rubble and Group of Seven, I mean, again, at its core, always at its core, is I'm trying to create a body of work that adequately, to its best ability, reflects the world that my ancestors understood and lived through, right? And I want to be 1000% as truthful and as rigorous about their story, and strong-willed about inserting their story, that it requires, so that it's their story was one so hidden and their presence was so not wanted that manifesting the world that they know is actually, it requires going into the white archives, the white art historical archive, law archives, immigration, all these things. It requires going into these archives and dredging up the dirt. I mean, there's nothing really, it's not entirely malicious, but the reality is what I'm trying to excavate is my family's origin story, and then by nature of there being that one freakish migration that was openly discriminated against, and that policy was used to disenfranchise and push them back, by nature of their being documented, this documented case, as in many ways Indigenous communities, same kind of a situation. By nature of having that history, documenting it, and working outwards, I'm not really doing anything other than assembling the material as it is.
Right.
This is not about some kind of sneaky kind of weaving together of it. Just is what it is. It was racist. It is racist, and I'm just doing the job of bringing it out and putting it in front of people. And then that opens up, the local archive turns into the National Archive, which turns into the global archive. And so right now I'm looking at British newspaper archives, taking it back to Queen Victoria, because again, the Dominion of Canada is very much attached to all of this, right? To empire. I'm looking at the royals, I'm looking at their life, and looking at the reality of the National Gallery. This is where we're at right now. I'm looking at the very real connection to royalty. Princess Louise, Queen Victoria's daughter, opened the National Gallery. And so why aren't we talking about that? Why isn't the National talking about that? Because it's kind of like serious that's a serious foundation in which this whole thing we're talking about is built upon, right?
They do credit her on the website.
That's nice.
Yeah.
But do they take it up?
There's a really interesting thing that I've observed about that space in particular. And the first thing I've observed is that there's incredibly brilliant people working there who are intensely critical, and they work there in order to contribute to change in the
Yes.
practice, right? Also,
Yes.
because the NGC is huge, and you know, it has its own genealogy. The ironic thing about it is, while they may support exhibitions of archive and art, it's not the institutional genealogy was obviously wrapped up in what constituted art at any given time and what constituted an artist at any given time. They weren't concerned with ethnography or anthropology. And so what we have then is a collection or a set of mechanisms that are represented by the collection to represent the scope of what constitutes the population of Canada. I'm getting somewhere cool here. Just
Okay, I'm following. I got you. Okay.
Oh, good. I'm glad, because I'm starting to flounder. So, what the hell? Oh, I get it. So there's a sort of an outward looking, which follows a really interesting trend in curatorial practice, which is to raise critical questions and critical dialogue in exhibition practice by having exhibitions that include historical and contemporary art and dialogue, right? So the Indigenous and Canadian Gallery installation did that. And I was able to work as a curatorial assistant on that project for my first stint at the NGC.
Sure.
And that was a strategy to address the fact that the NGC didn't have a history of collecting Indigenous art because it was considered craft or ethnography. And that history has actually been written about quite a bit and is well documented in other spots. Ironically, though, that archive and that history and the really sort of innovative dynamics when you place contemporary and historical Indigenous art together, the conceptual thrust behind that in an Indigenous content is amazing. It's really important, and it shows a very specific or can demonstrate a very specific worldview. What is not considered equal in many cases then is the history of the institution, the archive of the institution. So if you wanted to contextualize an installation like that, and I'm thinking specifically about installations like yours, where you have archival information, archival data, working collaboratively with contemporary concepts and political contexts, as well as contemporary art and historical art, at some point then the institution should be coming on board and airing their dirty laundry, as it were. So the field of inquiry and interrogation must include the institutions, and yet it doesn't. And so you get this sort of, I'm having a Foucault moment. You get sort of this heterotopic dome inside a dome where the knowledge is contained and controlled, and then there's institutional power to decide what is what.
Exactly. And that is something that continues to freak me out as my practice evolves and grows. And the people I work with are different these days than the people I was working with maybe 5 years ago. And so 5 years ago, I was working with curators that were kind of on the hot tip and really great women to work with, that were, really busting their curatorial butt to get new ideas out in the world, right? Taking risks, right? Very real risks to pervert the administration to enable me to say what I wanted to say. And so now we're at this interesting place where I'm working with organizations and institutions that want me to come to do that. Yeah. Just that very thing. And so it's got me thinking a lot about, well, it prompts me to continue to think through, what does it mean when my interventionist practice gets taken up? Because the game was, prior to a few years ago, I was this chick on the outside doing this crap, and there was a wonder, there was a beauty in being somewhat unknown. There was also a great torture in being unknown at the same time, but it afforded, it gave me a buffer, and I felt politically legitimate. you know,
Yeah.
as though being politically legitimate involves suffering and being impoverished in some kind of way, right? So it in many ways, I'm a lot like the people that you mentioned working at the NGC. I do this stuff now at this stage of the game because I see how enormous, how much work there is to do, right? But I continue to do it because it's not going to change if everybody leaves and leaves it high and dry, right? So that's part of the work, but it has got me in this place now of wondering if I am veering more towards curation. And I'm not to say by any, I don't want to alienate any curators out here who have done that long haul. I'm not really trying to say I'm a curator, but what I mean is like the way that I'm producing work now is more from it has a healthy amount of curatorial consideration within it, right? Mm-hmm. Which, then gets me thinking about, I would love it, not to be blaming about anything, but I would love it if more curators were doing that kind of work that was rooted in interrogation of its institution's histories, and then was doing that work of creating new scholarship, new lineage, new histories, new artistic forms. And I think,
yeah, well, it's really interesting because while there's valid critique against institutions for obfuscating their own histories of racism and silence, right? So those are valid critiques. When you don't, and it's not for every exhibition, but certainly for the Indigenous and Canadian galleries, for example, when you don't make the collecting history of the Canadian National Gallery part of that installation, then you silence that institution from being able to talk about, you silence individuals from being able to tell the story of how NGC became an important contributor to what constitutes Canadian national identity.
Yep.
Flaws and all.
Yeah.
Right. So it's an interesting, there's some, it abuts up against something I don't get. And fortunately I can ask people there about it, which is great. But it's about managing expectations and what does the audience expect from the institution, and again, who is that audience and what responsibility. So there's back of house, front of house. And I think one of the things that your practice does is it eliminates any kind of boundary between back of house and front of house.
Yeah.
The benefit is that you have the advantage of accessing internal archives without having to worry about getting fired or put on a different project.
Yeah, and
right?
but that also comes with a very real understanding of the limitations of what my co-conspirator curatorial allies can do, right? Yeah. I do recognize that this is their job, right? And there's a finality to what they can do, what they can offer to a project. And I suppose what I'm consciously taking advantage of as a maker is my ability, the expectation that I do things that are outside the box ish.
What's at stake if you don't do that work?
For me or the institution? All the above?
Let's start with you.
Oh, for me, if I didn't do this work, I don't know that I can. I struggle with even the idea of kind of trying to imagine what that would look like.
If you did something else?
I don't think I know how to do anything else. Really. I mean, I'm sure I could.
Yeah. Apparently you can cook.
Apparently, right. I'm sure I could. I think what gets in the way of that, I mean, practically speaking, I'm sure I could. But I think what gets in the way is the reality that what I do is not I don't think I really had a choice in this, from an ancestor place. I don't really think I had a choice in this. And art, I now have the advantage of years of hindsight to be able to see that my grandparents very consciously chose me to do this work. And I didn't appreciate it when I was younger and frankly, when they were alive. But they talk to me all the time. I feel a great deal of gratitude and indebtedness for the way that they cared for me in the latter years of their life. And as my grandparents' family, this family dies, literally. This family, my grandfather's family, the Risby family, is dying. It is nearing extinction. And so the work that I'm doing is critical in so much as I want to be able to let the people that are alive know that the family members that are alive know that their struggle was not for nothing, and that they all contributed to a very important history, and to let them know that the struggles they experienced were all happening within the context of their trying to make a place, a home for us. And I deeply value those things. And because I've done the historical work around their migration and their lives, I know how much pain they kept from us as they thought, we're thinking forward in generations and trying to imagine what the world should be like for me and beyond. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel a deep obligation to that work. I feel deeply connected, and it's genetic at this stage of the game. I was talking about, I also am a builder. I come from a community that built their own towns. So I tend to go around and build communities all over the place by nature of the work, right? Which is how we are connected, right?
Yes.
And many of the people I work with are in keeping with the kind of racial mix-up of the communities that my grandparents worked with, right? It's all, everything is everything. This is a continuation of a lifestyle that I was raised in many ways. Good farm people,
Yep.
And that logic flows through the work. And in many ways, the work is not inherently about race. It's actually more about a class of people that are akin, especially if we're talking about Black and Indigenous. It's a class of people that are, I don't mean to offend anybody, but akin to a class of untouchables, right? As far as like invisibility, and minimal expectation, and again, not to kind of really kind of to offend anybody around kind of the notions of Indian untouchables. That's not really, but it's the idea of being so unseen. Extraordinarily unseen. Gosh, the rocks and boulders and file folders and cabinets and offices and institutions that are on top of this little family. So really, the work I'm doing is about bringing them, the people, above all of those paperweights, so to speak. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So to speak. That's the work, right? And I couldn't imagine doing it because that work of unearthing all of this is effectively just me coming into being. It's me coming into knowing myself and where I come from.
Yeah.
And that's pretty darn addictive. It's also within this kind of a political and social climate. It's pretty damn necessary.
Yeah.
Right. So I couldn't imagine not doing this. It's the lifeline to my future, and by nature of the work that I do, it's ideally a lifeline to a whole bunch of other racialized and Indigenous kids' futures, right? Don't want to be seen as great mama with black mama with shoulders as broad as the universe, but I do think very much about carrying it forward and making it better for the next generation. good farm people wisdom, you know, not hoity-toity at all. And that's also why I try to introduce people like that into the work that I made. They need to be seen, you know.
Yeah,
So like
yeah, there's a lot of
the Sofia Pulley, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's an interesting strategy, one that I'm working through on another exhibition with Barry Ace and Earl True. How do you curate love? How do you curate connection?
Right.
How do you curate relations? So
That's a
thinking about
big
in a
question.
private collection, Barry Ace and Earl Truelove's art collection, which has none of Barry Ace's work. Barry Ace is an Odawa Anishinaabe artist. His partner Earl is an interior designer, and I've been working with them for a few years to catalog their collection. That collection, the reason I wanted to do this work was, first of all, I love those guys. They're really nice. And second of all, their intention for collecting is behind collecting specific artworks is how those artworks are connected to human relationships and how that impacts how they understand our criticism and who and where they're at in the world, right? So it's a very specific collection. And some people might call that navel gazing, but when I looked at it and mapped that across Indigenous art histories, as well as the history of contemporary art dealers in Ontario in the 80s and 70s, and the connection to LGBTQ communities in Toronto at that time, the network exploded. So it ceased to be a regional, intimate collection.
Yeah.
And it connected folks across the country and across time. And so I picked it up as my dissertation topic, which was great.
Yeah.
And when I think about the NGC and your practice, it's an attempt, certainly for me at the NGC, those relationships that I could have with staff and with artists, and then, you know, working to bring everybody together as part of a process for Àbadakone was really important. And it was a sort of top of mind strategy. And I shared that with, you know, Crystal Migwans was part of our curatorial team on that show, and she brought a lot of incredibly powerful information into that, and Greg and Christine. And so I worked with about 45 or 50 people who have relations of their own, and their knowledge informed how that show came about. And so it wasn't just curated by me, Greg and Christine. That's not how that show came about. The artists are part of that. You know, like it's a huge thing.
Yep.
And once you start mapping that, like flipping that focus and mapping that relations to connections between human beings, things start to fall apart. Ideologies start to fall apart. So the institution as a monolith dissolves. It's a culture of human beings who decide to perpetuate or resist, or variations of that theme.
Yeah.
And I imagine that's what my grandfather's life was like, and his family's life living in Manitoba, the Red River folks, when my great-great-grandmother signed script, right? I don't know what that was like. It didn't live as political Métis activists at that time, but I am, as well as someone who's trying to account for settler responsibility. And what does that look like? And so you think about that idea of the monolith and the institution. And it's the love and the care that you bring forward with your family and in your contemporary relationships that helps to create or make evident the cracks in the narratives of settler colonial domination.
Yeah.
Whether they're acted on or not is something entirely different.
Yeah. When I went, 2006, I went back. It sounds much simpler than it is, but I was able to backtrack to the plantation my family had been enslaved on. And that fried the brain epically, for a variety of different reasons. And I came back and then I entered into grad school, and I landed in one of the electives I had to take was a graduate history seminar. It was taught it was led by a gentleman named Michael Wayne, who is of Wayne and Schuster fame. He's the son of Johnny Wayne, the Black Jewish son of Johnny Wayne, which was an extraordinary experience because his take on Black American experience, the slave experience, was just so very different from most people's. So Where am I going with this? I had a point with this. I what did you just
It's the
say?
thicket, right? You're right in the thickets of,
And then it just ooh-ha-ha.
I know.
Care. You were talking about care. Da, 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 da,
Bringing
da,
your family forward.
da, 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 da.
Uh,
Localism. Yes. Okay, so Michael Wynn, when I met him, was writing a book about the United States being founded on obviously genocide and racism, which is not rocket science, but I think he had a very different take. But the short of it all is unbeknownst to me, he was interested in my family history, and I was just a hot mess of I just went to the South and what was that? And there was just this weird conversation we were having. He was trying to understand how Black settlers, that's not what I mean, but Black folks that have been brought here and are farmers and that kind of stuff that are in clan territory, like Alberta, like where my family is, how do they get by if you are in clan territory and if you know that, you know, everybody around you is racist? Not everybody, but many of the people around you are racist. How do you get by? And I just kind of, without thinking about it, just kind of said, well, you know, everybody's got to get along at the end of the day, right? It's the middle of nowhere. The seasons are harsh. It's an extremely hard way of living, and you have to figure out how to engage with people that you may or may not want to be around. Now, that doesn't always apply, but at its most basic level, it spoke to the way that my family speaks about Amber Valley and the settlements, the Black colonies, right? And getting along with people that did not like you in other circumstances, but in the dead of winter, you're going to figure out how to get along, right?
yeah.
That localism. And I think what we often forget when we start thinking about the big institutions and what it all means and all that big vision stuff, we forget that the very thing that makes institutions run is local engagement,
yeah.
Right? And at the local level, all that stuff doesn't really kind of come into the equation. Not so much. It's just like we need to get shit done, and this is how we're going to have to work together. And that's why it matters to bring it down to that kind of a class level engagement, people level engagement, is that it's important to know that, because things can be undone at that level with our little bit of power in the day to day.
Yes.
Great things can happen when people come together, right? On that level with a common belief, which either could be we need to rewrite Canadian art history, or we need to shovel the snow because it's been a harsh snowstorm. Either which way, it's local people that come together that inform the making of change, right?
Yeah.
So I think about that. And now I remember what I wanted to ask you before is you were talking about how your grandparents were not political. They were just living their lives, right? And you framed yourself as political, right?
Yeah.
And I find that an interesting concept to consider, because in many ways you're just remembering things.
Yeah.
You know, in a very everyday kind of life way. So how does that become political? Do you know what I'm saying?
Intention, I think. And the distinction I make is that I can't know what my grandpa and his family were about from the bits that I understand. And the way that my grandpa talked about being Métis, it certainly wasn't the way that I talk about it, or that other people I know talk about it, or that our relatives talk about it. But that doesn't mean that, it just means that I don't know and I'm assuming.
Yeah.
And that my intention is to engage in it strategically and politically, because the lack of understanding about Canadian colonial history and Indigenous history is damaging, almost in ways that are unquantifiable as we move forward.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The history of genocide is incredible, but I perceive that the genocide is ongoing in systemic and administrative ways that are so deeply entrenched. What was your question? I'm not trying to be glib, but
no. Yeah. Why political? I mean, and so why I say this is because you said it was about intention, why it becomes political through intention. And what I think about that is, well, that's good, sure. I still, at the end of the day, for my practice, I still think that I'm just aggressively remembering. That's it.
What's the value of that
Of aggressively remembering
versus,
political?
yeah, in terms of
Um,
this language?
Because white people aggressively remember their culture all the damn time. It's never political. But when racialized bodies go out and try to aggressively remember, then it becomes a problem and it becomes political.
Yeah.
That's why I just want to shift that, right, to this idea that this is just everyday living. I'm just remembering my people.
Yeah.
You can call it whatever you want, but this is just this real basic thing. Okay.
Yeah.
So Maya's out there sending lovely messages that say we've got 20 minutes left. So we probably should stop yammering to each other and open the floor to a question.
Well, because it's all about relations, you know? And there's a bunch of people out there who have probably contributed and continue to contribute to.
Yeah. We get so lot. It's just never. This is also why I work with her, because I just end up in these conversations like for days, hours, and like what? Yeah. So.
Yeah, I've been relishing in this dialogue, and I wanted to, cushion the time cue in the chat. Like, this isn't to shut it down, because I'm happy to sit here forever, frankly.
There has to be a hard stop somewhere, because otherwise it won't.
Yeah. Well, I have to teach this afternoon, so you should probably stop it at some point. But also, I want to hear what other people are saying.
Yeah.
For real.
Absolutely. So this is a moment where I'd love to invite folks to either put questions or maybe like suggestions for directions of commentary or dialogue in the Q&A space. I'll keep an eye on both of them.
Yep.
But to warm up the segue, I guess, is that a thing that makes sense? I guess to transition.
It wasn't. We weren't very finessed in our segue.
That's what I love about the cattiness of a dialogue, right? It has ebbs and flows, and that's how conversation feels. It has different textures.
Yeah.
Deanna, you said you have to teach this afternoon, and that's something that you both have in common. You both have a teaching practice, and I wonder if you wouldn't mind talking a bit about that, because, well, I mean, for selfish reasons, because I love a chat about pedagogy, especially when it's political. Pedagogy is political, but you both have terminal degrees in your respective fields, work with institutions, and I would say within the past couple of years, there's been perhaps more encouragement, welcoming space made for autoethnographic practices, talking about the self and not just the scholar. I noticed like your bios are both intentionally leading with who you are and what you're bringing to a position, and not your academic title first. So I would love to hear some remarks or reflections, if you have them, for the folks in the audience about how do you maintain that self in institutional practices? How do you bring that into classrooms and encourage or even model students to do that in kind?
Yeah. For me, what you see right here is how I teach. There's no why my bio leads with who I am in relationship to my community is because that same person is teaching here. There's no different connection. There's no difference there. And I would say, again, by kind of deeply aligning myself with my ancestors, again, they're farm people. I engage in the world like farm people, God-fearing God people. A family of preachers, deeply engaged in the community, and I am allergic to academic pretense because I think it just gets in the way of teaching, quite frankly. And one of the things about doing research with farm people that have very little to say, but when they say it, they mean it, and they've told you a great deal. It's out of engaging with them that I've just learned how much can be transmitted with everyday language. And I And how my teaching practice, how I engage in the world is also informed by the primary concern that I have around every project I do has to be something that I could explain to my mother, right? And I have to be able to explain it to her in everyday language. And if she can get it, then I'm good, right? And that has informed teaching. I'm a pain in the ass within the institution because I cuss like a sailor, and and my classrooms are deeply, deeply informal. Don't send people to my classrooms this year. Anyway, and I try to kind of keep the classroom light because we talk about really intense shit, right? So this afternoon, I'm teaching a class on the archive and difficult history, go figure. And the class is all grounded in my translating the way that I research into a class that teaches my students how to do that research. And again, it's grounded in those principal concerns around everyday people rewriting history, right? So these students invariably, Rachelle actually was the first guest in that class, actually. The students invariably have found themselves making work about their own families, and that has opened the door to a whole bunch of histories that they've never heard before. My fantasy would be that they continue to do that work. I don't believe that what I'm doing is inherently spectacular or something that anybody else could or could not do. I think being taught how to research this and think outside of the box opens the door for all kinds of future artists, historians, and that's where my teaching goes. Rachelle, what about you?
I like hanging out with people.
And so?
So we're very similar in this. My part of my bio is out of respect of honoring Indigenous sovereignty, specifically Métis nationhood, as I mentioned before, but also it's just how I was raised in the arts community. It's respectful, and it helps people to figure out how they want to come at you. And so it also gives an indication of your priorities and strategies to a certain extent. And so that's how I read bios. When I'm teaching, I think I wanted to keep teaching because so many people don't perceive, and then if they do perceive, they don't believe the complex interrelationships between institutions and cultural activism. I want to tell people about it, and they love, like, the students really engage in it, and I would have thought that they would have been bored by talking about how administrative infrastructure impacts knowledge production and dissemination, right? But they love it. And one of the first instances I had of this was when I was a student. I was researching post-secondary education and Indigenous activism by Indigenous artists who were faculty. And I burned out on that topic because the bureaucracy around post-secondary education was daunting, specifically because I was at that time subject to it. Also because the policy is absurd relative to what the actual labor is versus what the policy quantifies as the labor. So there was a real disconnect behind, what faculty do. But so if I'm aware of it, then I have a responsibility to share that awareness. And it's not about convincing people that I'm correct. It's about convincing people that they need to inquire. And that critical literacy, no matter what the result is to a certain extent, that's an important responsibility I have. And also because I was raised in a settler context and I moved through the world being read as a settler, I have a responsibility to work within settler contexts, sometimes specifically white supremacist context, to debunk those ideologies. And be that front line. And so I want to teach students how to do that and how to position themselves, and also let students, BIPOC students, know they don't have to do that labor. And so it's a really complex, but also basic kind of like how to be good to people, how to think about people. Have compassion, right? So much of our research and our academic and artistic practices are actually about being compassionate. And while, I look to, I've sort of made a bit of a transition to looking to how to work with white settler folks in settler colonial institutions. What does it look like? How do you explain white privilege to white settler cultural professionals? What does it mean when you begin to consider the administrative context is being predicated on the success of whiteness. What does that look like in the job? What does it look like in academia? So it's part of my research, and my research is informed by Indigenous methodologies, because that's part of who I am and how I want to be in the world. So my classes are equally informal. I swear a lot. Too informal sometimes, you know, like it's a good thing. But I'm also not, I'm not performing when I'm teaching.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You have to.
Exactly.
And I'm also collaborating, right? So I have a set of knowledges that these people may not, but they have a ton of knowledges that I absolutely don't have.
Absolutely.
And so I part of this decolonial strategy or possibly Indigenous methodologies in terms of pedagogical models that have informed my teaching is that it's about exchange and reciprocity, which really makes grading difficult. So
True that. True.
that's my sort of meandering answer.
Yeah.
But I do like teaching a lot. And then there's not that much difference between curriculum development and curatorial development. And I'm sure curators are going to be like, no. But for me, they make sense together.
There's so much pedagogy. Well, and this is my projection, but I see so much pedagogy in the curatorial work that you're doing, Rachelle, and also Deanna in your art practice. You don't leave those spaces of exhibition without thinking carefully and reflexively about what you were brought in with you when you started.
Yeah. I mean, I that is the plan. I mean, but that also is kind of, for me anyhow, it's a reflection of the practice. I hope I don't sound like a flake, but really, like I have I have many prizes, but I have two primary prize positions of my grandfather's. And one is his Bible that he preached from, and the other is the dictionary that he used to learn the words in the Bible. And so literacy was always an important thing with these black colonies. The first thing they build is the school, right? So I think a lot about that. I think a lot about, oh gosh, I lost it already. Gosh, Maya, how did you set that up? Can you repeat?
Something along the lines of, what folks bring into a space.
Wow.
It's different from then how we leave it, because there's a pedagogical exchange or moment, absorption of spending time with your work.
Teaching, yes. The work requires reading, and not just words, but visuals. It requires attention, and it requires engagement in a way that more passive art strategies. I need people to do the work. I don't want the work that I create to be passively consumed and discarded. I want you to learn something. And the community that's where I was going with my grandparents. The thing is about public pedagogy. Preaching in and of itself, aside from its religiosity, is also about public pedagogy in a way, right? Teaching, mentoring, if you're a good preacher, anyhow, right? So that's kind of where this work comes from. But it's also rooted somewhere deep in Black consciousness, double consciousness, and an understanding that white audiences in Canada often come to gallery spaces, and when they are confronted with racism or genocide or any other kind of dark white truth, the answer is, I didn't know. And so I'm just going to resolve that for you. Here, now you know. And so what are you going to do about that, right? And it's not to say that I'm inherently making work for them. I'm making work for me. I'm making work to remember my family. And I would just be beside myself. I would consider myself a failed artist if I did work about them that was consumed passively and forgotten. So the work is always going to be about, yes, you're going to learn something today. That sounds pretty badass, but... But that's the ambition.
Yeah. Well, it
That's the
relates
ambition.
to a question that's come up in the chat, Deanna, about your grandparents, but also listening,
Yeah.
which is, you know, a form of pedagogy, like you were mentioning, preaching, all of these different contexts, not just in the classroom.
Yeah.
And who is an MFA student, asks, you mentioned that you did not listen to your grandparents when they were alive, and I wonder what prompted you to start listening. And then she adds, I hope I'm remembering what you said correctly.
Yeah, you did. You did. I grew up in the 70s, just after the civil rights movement. And I lived in downtown Vancouver with my grandparents when my mom was living in the States. And so growing up with them was really weird because they're old school. You know, they came to, my grandfather was 3 when they came to the country in like the 1910s. And the things that they told me about were things that I couldn't possibly see. My whole upbringing was about, certainly from my grandfather's perspective, was about advising me about the places I shouldn't go in the country. Don't go to the prairies because the Klan is there. You know, that kind of teaching. And in urban Vancouver, that sounds like craziness because there are no Klansmen walking down the street in Vancouver. You know, there's no white hoods and all that kind of stuff. So I really thought them to be stuck and stuck in their past, and I didn't pay attention. I mean, I did, but I didn't. I didn't value what they were doing in the time. What made me turn is, quite frankly, their passing. My grandparents passed within 6 months of each other, and my family is a very old school African American family, Southern with its influences. My grandparents held it all down. They held us all together, despite whatever kind of in-family fighting and all of that kind of generational stuff and all that drama. Despite the white people that would come and smash down the door, my grandparents still had this ability to keep us together. And so when they passed, everybody scattered and the family just dispersed all over the place. And so I really, again, another kind of critical component of the work is I'm deeply homesick and I miss them. I miss my grandparents a great deal. And I was very fortunate. My grandmother left behind an oral history book that was created by the descendants, or the first timers, the old timers, in the Black colonies in Alberta. And so I inherited that. And I started doing the research when I was about 24. Is that true? And couldn't do the work. I was completely overwhelmed by the intensity of it all and put it down for 10 years. And then I went to I went down south and I landed in grad school, and that was when I started to do the work in earnest. But really, it's about missing them terribly. Just a sucky baby, really, that's all it is, right? Rachelle knows.
I appreciate that share though, Deanna, that sometimes, even though we have the interest or the curiosity, you know, we're not always ready or able to do it. And there is a time when that process feels more possible, or.
Yeah, and I would say from the students that I'm working with, there's an awareness for them as well, right? About history that they've been told over time that they can or cannot get into because maybe the time's not right. And I'm experiencing this fantastic experience with some of my students where the time is now, and being able to be part of their process has been extremely rewarding, right? Makes me super protective of them. But at the same time, it's just, I'm very thankful that they're willing to share this process. They feel safe enough to do this work with me, right? So yeah, it comes when it comes when you're ready. Yeah. Well,
I'm in such an awkward position that there's more comments coming in. There's a question in the Q&A that we haven't had a chance to get to, but maybe I'll just read it so that it's in the ether, because we are at 3 o'clock, and I'm mindful.
Nice timing, Erin.
And Rachelle has the rest of the day to get to, but Katya, who's also in our MFA program, is pondering around, is it better to change institutions from within or without? Is the domestic space, the local level, more important than the institutional elite? She follows up, it reminds me of Maya Angelou's approach. I know why the caged bird sings. So I suppose
Oh,
we're in response to
Katja.
comments.
Katja's in my photo studio class. Hi, Katja. Thank you for coming. It's just like you to drop that bomb at the very last minute. I'm just.
I can say really quickly, it could be, if you think about the question in terms of people and relationships, then the binaries dissolve. And it becomes a lot easier to think across strategies, maybe. I'm just gonna put that out there.
No, I back that across communities. The local invariably leads into the organizational, into the institution. Again, they're people, right?
Yeah, they're people.
They're people that potentially live around the corner from you or whatever. Yeah.
Some people maybe farm people.
Good farm people.
I know a couple of good farm people at the NGC.
See, there you go.
Yep.
Yeah. Erin, I'll catch up with you later, okay? That's also another bomb of a question at the honestly, Erin. Jeez. So another thing to put out into the world, Erin, yes, farm people. What are your respective thoughts on moving critical race theory outside of universities and museums during a time of growing white supremacist sentiment? Dude, really? At 3 o'clock?
No.
Maybe that's the tactic that, this conversation is an iteration.
Yes.
It will continue to be chewed on in all of our respective tributaries and the ecosystem of everyone who's come onto this Zoom and will travel forth.
Don't apologize, Erin.
Yes.
Don't apologize.
Thank you so much, Rachelle and Deanna, for sharing your afternoon with us. Thank
You're
you,
very
everybody,
welcome.
for joining in on the chat and the Zoom space. Thank you, of course, to Fourth Space for your digital hospitality, and the Studio Arts program for funding SICA. Yay!
Yay! Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Fantastic
Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. Special thanks to Deanna and Rachelle once again for sharing your work and ideas with us. And of course, Maya for making this and every SICA conversation possible. I guess I'll just remind people quickly that we have the final conversation next week, right, Maya? May. It's looking like May out there now for a second, but March 18th, is it?
Yes, March 18th with
Awesome.
Medeo. If anyone fancies reading a poem, come back and join us.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you have a great class this afternoon. It was great to
Thanks.
hear from you.
Thank you
and
very much.
wish you all a good afternoon. Thanks again.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.